Hi, everybody, and welcome to our week 3 feedback video. This is Richard and Craig.
Yeah, great to be with everybody again this week, and some quite interesting and at times challenging topics as we go further into the course, Richard.
This is a challenging course, Craig, and it is a challenging topic. We've actually had to tone down some of the exercises over the years because it used to stir up a lot for people. But even this week, I'm noticing a lot of our learners are sort of reflecting on things that are sometimes quite challenging. Some learners have even gone back to previous weeks and just done some of the kind of building block practices, let's say, which actually is very smart. Jen was passing on to us that some have done that, which is awesome. So it's a really good idea. And some have been jumping in, and the reflections are great. I mean, first of all, a lot of learners have realized how they are not being compassionate to themselves a lot of the time. In fact, it's not true for everybody, but for most people, the default setting is one of self-criticism and self-judgment, perfectionism, drivenness, when we really pay attention, that causes us suffering and stress because it causes contraction in the body and contraction in the mind and can lead to all kinds of problems. And our learners have started to notice that. And even that noticing is really important. One of our learners said, when I catch myself being self-critical now, I smile as I'm pleased I'm noticing it and can do something about it. And that's just such a beautiful comment because that's the attitude that we want, of course.
Yeah, that's right. And the attitude makes all the difference, because this is all part of the default mental activity. It's like a narrative we've got running through our mind. And I guess, rather than trying to argue with it or get rid of it, I mean, imagine if you were reading a novel and the stuff we have running in our head was the novel, it's like, or the story. We probably wouldn't be very interested to read it. It's like, I'll put it down. I might read something else. And in a way, we can sort of just treat that kind of mental activity like a novel that we're just not, a narrative that we're just not interested in reading or listening to. Just put it down, give our attention to something else.
Yeah, really smart, really smart. And some of our learners really like the second arrow analogy, which is, of course, a very old analogy from the days of bows and arrows, comes from the wisdom traditions, and is Tara Brach's the person that talks about that the most. And it's a really useful analogy, isn't it? Because when we are caught in the grip of self-criticism and self-judgment, and we've got an arrow in us, that's the first arrow, to then shoot subsequent arrows of judgment about that, and then judging ourselves for judging ourselves. It's just, we end up looking like a porcupine. So it's much better, as you said, just to tend to that first arrow and maybe bring some self-compassion or even just put that book down. Yeah. Now, lots of talk actually about self-compassion.
Yeah, really useful sort of theme, and deciding to actually be a little bit friendly to ourselves, to show ourselves a little bit of that consideration that we would show others that we care about. And why shouldn't we? Why wouldn't we care about ourselves? And I think there's a difference between the kind of self-care and self-respect as opposed to, self-indulgence or, gratification. We're not talking about that. We're just talking about just showing ourselves consideration for all of our recognizing our qualities when we notice them that are very useful, but also recognizing, our human aspects, our failings and foibles. And we're human, and it's just part of the rich play. And if we can just notice as that, then it really takes a lot of the sting out of things. But actually, it liberates the energy and the attention to address the things that we'd like to address.
Yes.
Rather than that energy and motivation sapping kind of activity of getting caught in self-recrimination, negativity, judgment, etc.
Yeah. Very, very important point. And I like that you make the distinction between things like self-compassion and self-indulgence or self-pity. And Kristen Neff, who's the researcher who more or less kind of kicked off the self-compassion research and is definitely one of, if not the leading researcher in the field, she makes very clear distinctions between things like self-compassion and things like self-indulgence and self-pity and weakness and a whole lot of stuff that a lot of people sort of sometimes think that self-compassion might be, because as you said, self-compassion is actually strengthening it. We stop sapping our own energy. We bring our attention fully back to ourselves and we start to welcome in the more sort of vulnerable feelings and vulnerable parts of ourselves. So we start to feel more integrated, and it actually makes us a lot stronger. And she says it's very different to things like self-indulgence. If you take an example of failing at something, messing something up, saying the wrong thing, Self-indulgence would be like, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. Who cares anyway? Kind of this sort of dismissive, and of course, that's not compassion because we don't learn from that and nothing changes. So it's a different thing. It can be subtle, but when you look at it, it's actually very different. Self-pity as well, if something goes wrong, you fail a test at school or something and you think, oh, it's so unfair. Why was the test so hard and they shouldn't be doing? That's kind of self-pity. And we get caught up in that, in the stories of that. Whereas self-compassion is very different. That'd be like, hey, this happened. I failed. I don't like that feeling. There's nothing wrong with me. I just made a mistake. And let's do the study that we need to do to do better next time. And that's really what compassion is. So it's not an excuse. You can't be overly self-compassionate. One of our learners said, I wonder if you can be overly self-compassionate and start finding excuses for your poor performance.
Yeah.
If you think about compassion as wishing happiness to yourself or others in the longer term, making excuses for poor performance and letting yourself off the hook and being self-indulgent, I don't think that's very compassionate, actually.
No, it's actually just another form of default mode circling around our ego most of the time. And so, when we human might make an error or think that wasn't a really, smart move or good decision and so on, it's self-compassion side of things. It's just the attitude that we bring to it. But it's interesting to notice where the attention goes next. Because if it's self-compassion but more mindful, there's a kind sort of attitude, but the attention goes to the issue and to addressing the issue, to a clear resolution. I need to learn to do that better, or to have more consideration for people around me, or to not ignore things when I need to get on with them. Whatever the lesson might be, the attention goes to it and acknowledges it. And there's a motivation to do something about it. The sort of the self-justification, the sort of the apathy is that there's something recognized, but the attention turns away. And it gets caught in a justification about it. And we can tell if we just look at it, there's a very subtle but important distinction between the two.
I like that distinction actually between, it's default mode, the self-pity, the self-indulgence, the self-criticism. It's all just default mode. And that disconnects us in a sense from ourselves because we get lost in that default mode activity. Whereas self-compassion connects us with ourselves. We come back to ourselves in a really healthy way and we find ourselves being more kind of grounded and still and more able to address, as you said, what's actually needing to be addressed. So it's a very good distinction, that one.
Yeah.
Our learners also really liked the steps around cultivating sort of positive mind states, which of course compassion and self-compassion are, in a sense, positive mind states. But there were some great comments there as well.
Yeah. And this sort of rewiring ourselves and some of the things that a lot of learners were noticing was things like gratitude and savoring. And again, savoring is not an indulgence. It's just, the simple act of enjoying and experiencing what we're experiencing in that moment. And it's very helpful. And in the same way, we can sort of notice and recognize things about ourselves. It's a slightly different thing when your ego gets in there and puffs out your chest and starts getting all proud, as opposed to just recognizing something, was well done, or recognizing something that we value in life. And it's really useful because if we cultivate that, we rewire ourselves, rewire the brain to start noticing positive things rather than sort of negativity we fixate on so much of the time as a sort of a habitual mode. So the savoring and the gratitude are things that we can really practice. And they overlap a lot, of course, with the positive psychology approaches to things.
Yeah, well, they do. And in a sense, some learners might think, oh, why are we doing all this kind of cultivation of positive mind states in a mindfulness course? But as you said, once we when we cultivate things like gratitude or savoring, we start to naturally savor the moment more and notice things that we're just naturally grateful for. And that actually brings us more into the present moment. And in fact, these practices, rather than creating something artificial, they point us back to the fact that, inherently, when we're not caught in default mode and reactivity, we are just naturally grateful. There's a natural gratitude that emerges. In fact, anytime we're being genuinely mindful, we are savoring the moment. We are compassionate. We are kind to others and ourselves. We are grateful for things. And so it's almost like these practices bring us back to what we always already are, but that we lose sight of sometimes.
Yeah, and you see that in so many of the wisdom traditions' practices of being thankful for things. And we've we've almost lost that in modern culture, haven't we? And there's so much, and we get, I suppose it gets reinforced on a lot of social media and other things, is to be negative and critical and trying to find blame the whole time.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily cultivate. But even in positive psychology, in terms of mindfulness, it's all about the use of attention. And we can make a more discerning choice about what we give our attention to and what we don't. Because what we give our attention to, we like plug it in the power socket. Away it goes. We don't, and we withdraw the power from it. And we can make that discerning choice.
Beautiful, yeah. And some great questions as well, comments around mindfulness and pain. A lot of our learners really love the pain meditation, as they always do in every run of this course. Even learners who don't have chronic pain found it quite useful. Some reflecting on how maybe this could be applied to things like childbirth. There was one comment as well around shifting, rather than resisting the pain, it might be good to shift the attention elsewhere. And that's interesting, because I guess that is one application of mindfulness. We don't want to focus on the pain, so maybe we just put our attention on something else. Some people mentioned their hobbies and things when they're engaged in life. You're not so much caught up in the pain, which is actually a very healthy thing. And if you look at the original research, let's take Jon Kabat-Zinn and his program for pain reduction, which is actually where secular mindfulness began, in a sense. I mean, you were doing your thing at that time, and he was sort of starting to carve out this whole sort of pain reduction thing, which became mindfulness-based stress reduction. And he said, look, we do get caught up in our pain in a contracted way, and it is good just to focus on our lives and pleasant events and things like that. But there's also something else that needs to happen, which is we need to actually be willing to fully feel the pain. Because usually when we're trying to focus our attention somewhere else, there's the potential that we're subtly, or perhaps not so subtly, resisting what we're feeling. Mm-hmm. What we resist persists. As you said, if we're giving our attention to something in any way, it turns up the volume, it plugs it into the power socket. And if we're subtly resisting pain, it's actually giving attention to pain, and it's keeping it stuck. And there's a whole lot of secondary suffering that starts up around that, all the self-criticism, self-judgment, fear, anxiety, depression, etc. And so the whole point of mindfulness in the end is to be able to feel the pain in it just as it is, without the judgments and reactions. And the research that Jon Kabat-Zinn did early on, of course, found that when people are able to be with their pain in that way, their subjective pain actually decreases because there's no more secondary suffering. They come off their meds, they're less anxious, less depressed. And so it's actually about turning towards rather than turning away in the end. Yeah. And that's a very important distinction, isn't it?
Yes, and the hypervigilance for the pain is different to just an awareness of a sensation. And as a sensation, it is what it is. And the most common misunderstanding is if I practice mindfulness, it'll make it go away. And that's not the process. So the turning attention to the pain can help us to notice it for what it is, to be aware of and work with the emotional reactions, etc. And the other point is also that we can then engage attention on other things in our day-to-day life. And as we know, when dealing with a distractor, we're trying to block it out, it becomes more intrusive. And we can also learn to notice a sensation, but as we engage our attention more and more with our life, the people and so on, then that pain doesn't dominate as much. It starts to recede into the background, like the sounds that might be happening in your environment right now that are not related to this video. They kind of recede into the background if the attention engages with what we're saying. Not because we're trying to block them out, but just because our attention goes somewhere else.
Yeah.
So very interesting things to know. And the point is, too, that the same attitude, the same practice, it works with emotional pain as well.
Yes.
It's not a sensation, it's an emotion, but it has physical effects on the body, but it's cultivating the same awareness, the same attitude, the non-reactivity, not blocking it out, and learning to be with it in a different way. So it's all the same principles, whether it's physical or emotional pain, really.
Yeah, really great point, that one. Fantastic. So next week, we're going to introduce choiceless awareness meditation, which is just sitting and being with no apparent focus for the meditation. Some people find it challenging, but it's actually a very powerful practice. So I look forward to that one. Ethics and values as well. Mindfulness helps us to look deeply inside and get in touch in a very intuitive way with what's important for us and noticing when we're in and out of alignment. And we're going to, of course, look at bringing mindfulness into daily life. Just a reminder as well that this course will, obviously, we've got another week and then it will finish, and you'll have, I think, a couple of weeks of access to the materials, so you can keep revisiting the practices. And if you upgrade, you'll have lifetime access to all of the materials. So we strongly encourage you to do that, both for your own benefit, and also it helps us to run it, because there's us in front of the camera here, but there's a whole team behind the scenes making this happen. And of course, Jen and people like that who are involved. So please support the course and support your own ongoing mindfulness journey with an upgrade. But until then, happy practicing. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.